Carl Djerassi is a renowned scientist, educator, author, playwright, and philanthropist who achieved excellence in both science and the arts. He was the first to synthesize the oral contraceptive, best known as the pill, for which he received the National Medal of Science in 1973. Dr. Djerassi is credited with pioneering research in synthetic organic chemistry and medicinal chemistry. He has published more than 1,200 academic articles and 7 books. Dr. Djerassi was awarded an Honorary Doctor of Science degree from Rutgers University. Dr. Djerassi, thank you for joining us today. It's a huge honor to have you on our show. Some would describe you as a Renaissance man. You've done everything from science to arts to philanthropy and fundraising. Of your career thus far, what would you consider one of your proudest moments?
Well, I'm a typical ex-scientist in that I always am proud of just what I'm doing. So right now I'm finishing a play. It's my 8th play, and I'm, again, finishing a novel, which will be my 6th novel. So I'm really focusing on that. It's my new life, really, having moved away after 50 years from science.
Well,
you, of course, would like to have a different answer. You would probably want to say the pill. But of course, in many respects, that is true. But you asked me about it right now. You know, the pill was, for me, nearly 60 years ago, for most other people, 50 years ago. But I'm a chemist, not a biologist or clinician, so everything has to start with chemistry, and the chemistry started much earlier than the biology or the subsequent clinical work.
Well, let's go a little bit over your life, because I think some folks who don't know your bio don't understand potentially that you started as a scientist and that you contributed a great deal to the world of science in terms of chemistry and medicinal chemistry, as well as moving into the arts later on. That's the question. Did you move into the arts later on, or did you do them both at one time, or did one grow out of the other? Because your bio kind of looks at science first and art second.
Well, in chronological, that's completely correct. I didn't start writing literary things until I was in my early 60s. Not 1960s, but my early 60s. So I'd been a research scientist, professor of chemistry for over 40 years. But then I decided to change. I wanted to sort of reinvent myself. And for a few years I did both things simultaneously, primarily because you can't just drop something from one day to another, particularly not in science where I have a large research team, graduate students, postdocs. You can't tell them from one day to another, that's it. But since 1992, when I closed my lab, I still did some teaching, but the teaching I then did was not any more standard chemistry. But from then on, I was a writer and lecturer, and that's really what I've been doing ever since. And about 12 years ago, I moved from writing fiction, very special type of fiction, which I called science in fiction, to differentiate completely from science fiction. So for every 10,000 science fiction books, there's one science in fiction book. I then moved to playwriting.
Well, let's go back to earlier career. You had talked about the pill. This is the 50th anniversary of the pill. Can you talk to me how you were instrumental in working with the concept of the pill and kind of how it came to be?
Yes, but you want to remember, this is not the 50th birthday of the pill, although people claim it is. It's the 59th birthday.
Okay.
It all has to start with chemistry, and I'm a chemist. And actually that work was done in a place and a time that no one would have expected. We worked on it in 1950 and 51 in Mexico City. Mexico at that time was absolutely a desert when it came to research, to advanced research, particularly in this rather tough field of chemistry, steroid chemistry. But I've been invited by, actually I started in New Jersey. I first worked for, after I got my Ph.D., worked for a Swiss pharmaceutical company, Ciba, which is now part of Novartis, which was in Summit. So for 5 years I really worked at Summit. And then I was invited by a small Mexican company to serve as director of chemical research. What their really interest at that time was develop a new synthesis of cortisone. That was very important at that time. But at the same time, worked on another project. We wanted to make some new proprietary drugs and worked on progesterone. Progesterone is a female sex hormone.
Okay.
And it really is nature's contraceptive, although people don't really think of it that way, because women do not get pregnant during pregnancy. And that is because that is the only time when they secrete progesterone continuously. But at that time, remember we were talking about 1950, there was no interest in birth control. This was not on the priority list of either the general population just after World War, nor of any of the pharmaceutical industries. In fact, again, there was a company here next door, Johnson & Johnson, that really was active in the birth control field, but from the standpoint of diaphragms and vaginal jellies and spermicides and so on. Progesterone was used for the treatment of, medically, for the treatment of menstrual disorders and infertility, because a woman not only needs during pregnancy to produce progesterone all the time, so she doesn't produce another egg and gets pregnant during that time, but she also needs enough progesterone to create the proper environment in the uterus for the development of first the embryo and then the fetus. And if women don't have enough progesterone, they suffer a spontaneous abortion. So it was treated, people treated for that. Progesterone, unfortunately, is not active by mouth, so all this involved injections. Okay. Now, already in the 1920s, an Austrian named Haberland had suggested, why not use progesterone as a contraceptive? Sounds perfectly natural, but as I said, that would involve daily injections, and that's just not realistic. So 30 years later, after Haberland's suggestion, we decided to work in that field, conceived of a compound that doesn't exist in nature that might have these properties, namely have the same biological properties as a natural hormone, but be orally active. And about a year later, we succeeded in doing this, and the real birthday, therefore, the chemical one, is October 15, 1951, when we synthesized a compound that generically is called norethindrone. Okay. And that was the first synthesis of what eventually turned out to be an oral contraceptive, but initially was approved by the FDA in 1957, so that's another birthday. Okay. For the treatment of menstrual disorders and infertility treatment. At the same time, another product very similar to ours called norethindrone, which was synthesized about a year and a half after we published our work by a competitive company called G.D. Searle, also was approved for the same properties. And 3 years later, in 1960, and that's why people now celebrate the 50th birthday, the FDA approved the extension of this compound for menstrual disorders and infertility to contraception. And of course, that use became much more famous and of course in a way more important, and there are well over 100 million women in the world right now who are taking oral contraceptives.
But your conversation in your development of kind of the evolution of the pill is not your only chemistry kind of accolade. Later on in your career, you've won awards for your medicinal kind of chemistry conversations in your research. Can you talk a little bit about the evolution from what you did then to a little bit later in the 70s in terms of the next award that you had won?
Well, you know, I won lots of awards, but the award part is not really the important one. The pill, societally, is of course the most important thing I've worked. Scientifically, by no means. You know, I've published hundreds and hundreds of papers after that, and I published maybe 100 papers before then. So that was a step in my work primarily in the steroid field. I think what is scientifically the most important thing, but clearly not really translatable easily into your terms right here in the program, is the development of physical methods in organic chemistry, and these were techniques that wouldn't mean much to people. Optical rotatory dispersion, circular dichroism, magnetic circular dichroism, mass spectrometry. These are physical methods that are very important in organic chemistry. So it was really methodology. And the other thing I consistently worked on was the chemistry of natural products, and that means looking at naturally occurring materials, primarily plants, but sometimes also animals, from which one isolates chemicals whose structure you do not know, but whose function is interesting. Progesterone, of course, is a good example. Not that was before I was really a chemist, but progesterone, for instance, is an example. One knew from glandular extracts that there is a product that prevents ovulation in women. As I said, they do not become pregnant during pregnancy. This man, Haberland, in the 1920s postulated, let's use that without having a pure substance. He had to use glandular extract. Well, the natural product chemists, and there were chemists at that time, mostly in Germany, then isolated the pure compound, named it progesterone, then synthesized it, and then you had it. And then you could do biological and clinical work. Well, that's the sort of thing I did for many decades, and that also is the important work. Then I also worked on synthetic medicinals, you're quite right. In fact, the very first thing I ever did, before I even went to graduate school, because I worked at SIBA here in Summit for a year between graduate from college, was synthesis of one of the first two antihistamines, called puribenzamine. That was really my first sort of real contribution to medicinal chemistry, and you can well imagine I was 19 years old at the time, so this was important for me because I became unbelievably optimistic. I thought, well, this, if you can do it that quickly, which of course is naive, but it was good for my psyche, why not work on this? Then I worked on corticosteroids and on other medicinal agents.
So how does one become so successful in academic chemistry and really lay groundwork for research and for other folks to build foundation on, and make the jump from the science area over to writing novels and plays? Specifically, as you talked about earlier, writing novels about science in fiction as opposed to science fiction.
Well, I tell you, it's related to actually the contentious title of my commencement address at the Newark campus, which people didn't know it ahead of time, but it's called In Praise of Polygamy. Well, they may be shocked in thinking there's this mad professor from California now talking about polygamy in this day and age, but I'm talking about intellectual polygamy, of course, and not marital polygamy. And I always was that. I was always interested in lots of different things at the same time. I don't think you can't be a writer unless you're a reader, and I always did do that. But we decided that time to become a smuggler, an intellectual smuggler, and see whether I could describe to a general public who either is afraid of it or doesn't think of the topics or thinks they don't understand it, about things that are related basically with sex and reproduction, because that is one of the areas, of course, in which I was working on. Instead of giving lectures or writing, technical books, disguise them in the nature of fiction. And that's what I meant by science in fiction, is that everything I describe is either true, has happened, or is plausible, none of which applies to science fiction. You can invent anything that you want to, and that's fine. I did not want to invent it. I wanted to use my fiction for purposes of smuggling ideas into people's mind who would not otherwise be prepared to even pay attention to them. So I'm obviously writing a novel that ought to be interesting and amusing and exciting for the sake of the reason that people read novels. But when they're finished, they suddenly discover they've learned something. And that was also the reason why I went from there to playwriting. Because if you think about it, we scientists are not allowed, nor do we permit ourselves, to write anything in dialogic fashion. Yet that was started by the Greeks and went all the way to the 17th century. Galileo, for instance, wrote many things in dialogic form. Now, I'm not talking about theater plays. I'm talking about describing something dialogically, in a way we are talking right now about a topic. Although I am mostly doing the talking and you're asking the questions, so that's not much of a dialogue. So right now, but that stopped in the 17th century more or less. So now the only literary form of dialogic writing, basically, is theater. And I am an obsessive theater goer. And I think there's certain things about theater which no other medium can do, not TV, not films and so on. So I became interested in that, particularly because in the, I see maybe 30, 40 plays a year, and I've been doing this for decades. You essentially never find a scientist in a play. You find Frankensteins or Strangeloves or nerds or idiot savants, but you don't find reasonably normal people. I consider myself one of these, with pros and cons, but still looking and behaving like more or less a normal person. So I wanted to use the theater for that purpose. And that this is, for instance, my first play is called An Immaculate Misconception. Well, it's a good title. You have no idea what it's about. So you go to the play of the title, you haven't heard of the playwright yet. So, but people do go to plays where they do not know the playwright. Well, to give an example, that's a play. Actually, it opened first in England. Most of my plays, in fact, all my plays first opened in London. But this also ran in New York. In fact, it ran in New York exactly. It was supposed to have its dress rehearsal on September 9th, 2001.
Oh, wow.
And I flew over on that particular day from London to New York and was in the first plane that was diverted and ended up in Halifax.
Okay.
And I thought, someone up there tells me, don't write plays, because stick to your own things, but it was eventually done. Well, that's a play, for instance, it's been translated into 12 languages, been broadcast by the BBC, World Service, by NPR here in the States, by many other places. It's still being performed in various places. So it's of general interest. And it dealt really with a topic that my last play called Taboos, which opened in London and New York just a couple of years ago, deals with the separation of sex and reproduction, something that people find shocking because they think it's abnormal and so on, and I point out that in fact that has become the normal state of affairs, although we don't like to accept it. And it's particularly striking in Europe, although here of course also. But in Europe, the average size the family is 1.5 children. He has a little bit over 2. Well, people have sex hundreds of times during their life.
Right.
I mean, many people. They produce 1 or 2 children, and they have sex before and after they've had the child frequently. So therefore, they have sex for different reasons, for love, for lust, curiosity, you name it, whatever it is. Reproduction, very rarely. And the consequences of this, both scientifically and particularly culturally and socially, are enormously important, particularly the role they play, and of course the people who are responsible for that, primarily women. The situation of women has changed dramatically during the last 30, 40 years. More and more can now break into important positions in male-dominated disciplines. Well, you'll find here the Rutgers commencement here, there are more women getting honorary doctorates than men, which I think is marvelous. And at least one of them is directly concerned with the field that I'm talking about, Eleanor Smeal, so just to use an example for that. So I write things about that.
So let's talk a little bit, because the other thing that you're really involved is the idea of philanthropy. You created a foundation to kind of look at some of the things that you're interested in. Can you talk a little bit about your foundation and kind of what it does and how it ties your disciplines together and kind of what it's for?
Yeah, but that's a separate proposition. It's called the Djerassi Resident Artist Program. Originally it was called the Djerassi Foundation. I founded it in 1978 when my daughter was an artist, died. She committed suicide. This was, without question, the biggest tragedy of my life, and it remained that. And suicide is very different from other death. It's a message to the survivors. How you read that message, I don't mean just a letter that's left behind. The letter was written to her husband. But why that happened. It was totally unexpected, and I was extremely close to my daughter, who was 28, she died. And we lived, I was divorced at that time. So I was living alone on a very large ranch close to San Francisco, and I commuted to Stanford where I taught. And my son and my daughter each had homes on that ranch. So we lived in the same property, but it took an hour to walk from my house to her house, so it's not next door. So we were very close, and I really felt that I wanted to do something about this. One of the reasons, she was really very concerned about the role of women in the profession that she had chosen. So I decided to establish at that time first a foundation just for women artists, and at that time it was primarily women visual artists. But after a few years, I realized that even that is not, we're living in a world where men and women have to live together and convert that really into an artist colony. It's become one of the largest in the West Coast, and we've had by now over 2,000 artists in the last 30 years. And art in this case means writing, visual arts, choreography, and composition. And there are roughly 70 or 80 artists a year. There are 10 at a time. And what they really do, there are more women than men, but it's not deliberate. It really works that way. And that has turned out to be spectacularly, not only successful, for me satisfying, because I felt that I was creating something living out of a death. That, of course, what I wanted to do. I didn't want to build any memorials or anything like this. And my wife, my third wife, with whom I'd been married for 20 years, who really co-founded that with me, because I met her just a year before my daughter died. Diane Middlebrook, a very well-known writer and biographer, she died 2 years ago from cancer. And so we're now trying to expand that facility with another building for additional writers. So this will be an even larger project. And the idea is to make it possible for artists to work without disturbance, without interruption, without having to worry about anything other than doing their own laundry, I guess.
Okay.
Because it's free. They have to get themselves to that very beautiful place. It's a big ranch overlooking the Pacific, very near San Francisco. You have to apply, because of course we can't take all we get roughly 800, 900 applications for roughly 80 openings a year. And whatever they do belongs to them. So it's not a question that they're doing something, leaving it behind.
Right.
Actually, the only people who leave something behind, since it's a spectacular landscape and it's hundreds of acres, environmental sculptors, which is something which is not easily done, because site-specific sculptures, you need a site to do it in.
Right.
And particular people who live in urban settings, this is somewhat more difficult. So there are some wonderful site-specific sculptures, which of course are designed exactly for the spot where they appear and are left there. And so there are maybe 40, 50, 60 sculptures all over. It takes about 4 hours to see them if you wander around.
Explain to me your interaction with those artists when they're there. Do you see them twice a year, often, in terms of being able to interaction?
Well, originally, my own house was on the ranch, and well, it was a mile away, but it was in the same place. And I lived there alone, and said, well, it was professor at Stanford, so evening, of course, I always came home. And the real event there, the artists come, they have studios, no one can disturb them during the day unless they invite someone.
Okay.
In the evening, they always eat together. And these dinners are really quite spectacular, because that's when people talk after a whole day of work, and they talk about what they did, they presented. A dancer would dance for them, a musician will play what they composed, and so on. And I used to join them once or twice a week for dinner. So I got maybe the first 600 I knew very well.
Right.
But then after that, I got married again, and later on started to live part of the time in London.
Okay.
And now I live 8 months of the year in Europe, between London and Vienna, and only 4 months California, when I still teach again at Stanford. And I might digress for a moment, but what I teach at Stanford is not chemistry, but is interdisciplinary seminar of a type that had never been offered before at Stanford. Namely, it's interdisciplinary between two departments that don't collaborate, usually chemistry and drama, and it's called Science in Theater.
Okay.
And it's really a wonderful course. I enjoyed it, and the students enjoyed it. It's quite sophisticated. But to return, except for these 4 months, so during that time I'm in Europe. And for instance, right now I just flew over from London yesterday. So I don't see artists that often anymore.
Okay.
But whenever I come, I always have dinner at least once a month, sometimes twice a month, because they're staying there for a month, so I'd like to meet them. I consider myself an artist myself right now. So it's not only that I'm an observer or let's say the founder, it's now a public institution. It's not just dependent on me. I'm not on the board anymore. My son is, who's a filmmaker, but it's a large board of 14 or 16 people, and the support comes really from all over, from National Endowment for the Arts, foundations, to many individuals. It's a fairly expensive proposition to run.
It sounds fascinating, and being a fan of the arts, it's one of those things that I'm very excited about in terms of what you do, and excited to hear kind of the atmosphere that's there. It sounds very electric at dinner.
But I have another. The arts have been very important to me, and not only because my daughter was a professional artist, but I was a collector of art for many years, and in fact, in a way, still am. And I had a very large art collection starting in the 1960s. Most of which I then sold to fund this particular program telling about, except for one artist, who is my favorite artist, and I never sold any of his work and continue collecting. That's Paul Klee. And I have a large Klee collection, which I've donated half and half to two museums, one in San Francisco, Museum of Modern Art, where they continuously have collections by Paul Klee, a very famous Swiss painter, and the other half to the Albertina Museum, which is a fantastic museum in Vienna.
Right.
And they have then rotating exhibitions of Klee all the time.
I know the Newark campus is extremely excited about honoring you for lots of different reasons. One, just based upon the conversations that we've had thus far, but more so because when you came to the U.S. as a child, you came to Newark. And a teenager, you came to Newark, and you went to a Newark school. So what does it mean for you to come back to Newark to receive an honorary degree from someplace like Rutgers?
Well, it's in many respects a very moving experience. I've had, something, I don't know, around 24 honorary degrees, so sort of, you might say, what's one more? But it's totally different from any of the others. Because as I said, I came as a refugee to the United States at age 16 in 1939. And by mistake, which we don't have time for, it's amusing enough and people can read about it in my autobiography, I ended up in Newark, New Jersey. And it was a Newark of the type that Philip Roth, for instance, describes. So effectively, whether it's in Portnoy's Complaint or some of the other things, Newark meant to him what it meant to me. I was taken in by a wonderful Newark family named the Myers. Frank Meyer was a chemist, strange enough. And in all the years, and I've lived in God knows where, all over the world, and so many places I don't even remember some of the addresses. I still remember that address, 617 Highland Avenue, Newark, New Jersey. I don't know the postal code, but I can tell you, and I plan to see that. And I had not been, and then I was here for 1 year at Newark Junior College. Right. And that's where I really started my education. I then went from there to the Midwest and to Kenyon College in Ohio, and then got my Ph.D. at Wisconsin. But it all started in Newark without any question, and I was penniless. So I had not been back to Newark since, other than every once in a while passing through on a train to Washington. But 2 years ago, there was a medicinal chemistry symposium, and I was invited to speak. And it was at the Hilton Hotel in Newark, and that's the only thing I saw. I was there only for that one day, so it doesn't count. So this is really my first return to Newark, where it all started. And I plan to go to 617 Highland Avenue, and I'm going to stand there in front of it and think.
It's kind of like a homecoming in some ways.
In many respects, it's an enormous homecoming.
Well, Rutgers wants to congratulate you, and we're so honored that you're here. Our time is up today, and hopefully sometime again we'll get a chance to meet, but thank you so much for being on the show. And I hope our viewers learned a lot, so thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.